Have you ever wondered why we vote the way we do, or why entire nations will rally behind certain leaders, sometimes against their own best interests? Well, today we're diving into this explainer to explore the fascinating, long-standing affair between two massive intellectual worlds, political science and psychology. For a really long time, these disciplines operated in their own separate silos. But to truly decode the complex world of politics, the leaders we elect, the policies we support, the conflicts we wage, we absolutely have to understand the human mind. This intersection is the dynamic subfield of political psychology. So we're going to unpack the rich intellectual history of this cross-pollination and map out exactly how experts have tried to decode our political behaviors over the past century. We've got a lot of ground to cover, so our agenda today moves chronologically. We'll start with the field's birth in a time of global crisis, move through three distinct eras of the 20th century, and wrap up by looking at where the field is heading today.
Let's kick things off with Part 1, the birth of political psychology. Now, to really grasp this field, we have to spend some time on its historical origins. Because the formal birth of political psychology wasn't just some abstract academic exercise. It was a desperate, urgent response to global crisis. The devastation of the 1937 bombing of Guernica in Spain symbolized humanity's struggle against rising, terrifying aggression. As fascist movements swept across Europe, leading to the unimaginable horrors of the Second World War, social scientists had a massive wake-up call. They realized that traditional political science, which basically just focused on institutions and laws, was totally unequipped to explain how ordinary, everyday citizens could flock to extreme authoritarian tyranny. They urgently needed psychological tools to understand how a political pathology like that could grip entire nations.
But this 20th century mobilization didn't just happen out of nowhere. It actually built on centuries of philosophers grappling with human nature. Think about Niccolò Machiavelli theorizing about cynical, self-serving leadership way back in 1513, or Thomas Hobbes famously describing the life of political man as nasty and brutish in 1651. Fast forward to 1908, and you have Graham Wallas warning proponents of democracy that human action is rarely a purely intellectual process. It's messy. It wasn't until 1930, though, that Harold Lasswell, who's often considered the first American political psychologist, really systemized this. He began studying the actual clinical files of politically active people, ultimately arguing that leaders often project their very private hidden conflicts onto public symbols. It's a fascinating foundation.
Building on that rich history, we enter Part 2, Personality and Culture, which defines the first era.
To understand how the field evolved from those early days, we look to William J. McGuire's incredibly useful framework. Notice how the discipline reliably shifts its preferred topic, theory, and method every 2 decades. In the 1940s and 1950s, right after the war, the field was absolutely dominated by a focus on political personality. The global trauma was fresh, and researchers were fiercely determined to uncover the deep-seated personality traits that made mass populations susceptible to dictatorial rule. So they relied heavily on analyzing clinical records and historical archives.
So how exactly did they approach this monumental task in Era 1? Well, they relied on something called environmental determinism. This was the prevailing belief of the time that nurture essentially trumped nature. To figure out how regular citizens became followers of extreme right-wing movements, theorists looked strictly to environmental forces. They believed that early childhood experiences, socialization, and tough economic environments were the literal forge for a person's underlying political personality.
Researchers back then really viewed political pathology through two very dominant, distinct lenses. On one side, you had Marxist economic materialism, which argued that political consciousness is entirely dictated by economic structures and class struggles. On the other side, Freudian psychoanalysis argued that political behavior was driven by unconscious motivational forces. When they combined these two, we got famous studies like the authoritarian personality. The idea was that economic hardship led to strict parenting, which in turn created adults with repressed hostility who are highly prone to idolizing authoritarian leaders and blaming outgroups.
That brings us to Part 3, Attitudes and Voting, marking the second era.
By the time the 1960s rolled around, the field went through a massive paradigm shift. Those heavy clinical and psychoanalytic theories from the post-war years started to completely fall out of favor. Basically, researchers traded the psychoanalyst's couch for George Gallup's surveys. Instead of looking backward at dusty historical archives or diving deep into a single person's clinical files, the methodology shifted toward measuring mass voting behavior in real time. Survey research literally exploded, allowing political psychologists to capture the attitudes and opinions of thousands of citizens all at once.
Unlike the intense, emotional, and unconscious focus of the 40s,
Era 2 assumed we were all perfectly logical processors. They called this the rational choice assumption. The thinking was wonderfully simple. First, you form cognitive beliefs based on your environment. Second, those beliefs cleanly shape your internal affective preferences. And third, boom, those preferences logically channel outward into cognitive actions, like pulling a lever in a voting booth. It assumed a very neat, benefit-maximizing view of the electorate.
This basic environment predisposition response, or EPR model, was incredibly linear. The political environment, let's say a candidate's speech or a new economic policy, directly feeds into a voter's internal predispositions. Those predispositions then act as a perfectly clean conduit, spitting out a predictable political response or vote. It was such an organized way to view politics. But, as we all know today, human beings are rarely ever that simple.
And that realization leads us right into Part 4, Ideology and Decisions, our third era. By the 1980s and 90s, Era 3 zoomed way in, prioritizing how our brains actually process information. The main focus shifted to social cognition. Instead of just mass polling, researchers started using experimental social psychology to see exactly how we form judgments. They analyzed things like cognitive complexity, impartially examining the different cognitive styles of conservatives versus liberals to see who exhibited more ideological rigidity. They also looked up at the top of the power structure, studying why powerful groups of highly educated leaders could still make incredibly disastrous foreign policy decisions, a phenomenon famously termed groupthink.
If you think back to that basic linear EPR model from earlier, this era completely shattered it. The middle predisposition box exploded in complexity. It was now seen as a maze of biological underpinnings, fundamental needs, ego defenses, and most importantly, perceptual screens. Political psychologists realized the environment doesn't just cleanly pass through us. Our conscious and unconscious orientations actively distort and filter the political environment before we ever even formulate a response.
William J. McGuire really captured the essence of this era by building on a famous Winston Churchill quote about democracy. This period highlighted that modern politics is essentially just one giant mass-mediated persuasive campaign. With the rise of television news and carefully curated candidate imagery, democratic politics became completely dependent on how our complex cognitive screens process media. Whether a persuasive message is successful or not depends entirely on how our unique brains frame and organize that specific information.
Finally, Part 5, the future of the field, bringing us to the fourth era.
So, we've moved from the historical, psychoanalytic roots of the 40s, through the rational polling of the 60s, right into the cognitive complexity of the 80s. Where does this long affair go from here? Well, McGuire predicted a fourth era, which is the one we are actively living in today. Researchers are increasingly looking at how evolutionary psychology actually shapes our tribalism. They're exploring the deep-seated psychology of collective violence and trying to understand the enduring problems of social dominance and systemic inequality. The modern political psychologist is basically trying to figure out how our biological predispositions interact with our cultural environments to form our collective identities.
Knowing that literally everything, from historical tragedies and economic structures to deep biological underpinnings and cognitive screens, shapes our political reality, what should you actually take away from this explainer? Well, the next time you watch a political debate or read a piece of campaign literature, take a second to ask yourself which of your own perceptual screens are filtering that information. Understanding the history of political psychology doesn't just help us understand the electorate out there, it actually helps us understand ourselves. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning what you see.